The California sun hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows across the streets of Hollywood. It was late afternoon, and the day's heat was finally beginning to relent, giving way to the cooler promise of evening. James Dean stood in the parking lot of Competition Motors on Vine Street, his lean frame silhouetted against the amber light. At just 24 years old, he possessed a magnetism that was impossible to ignore, a quality that had already made him the face of a restless, questioning America. His silver Porsche 550 Spyder gleamed before him, its sleek, compact body low to the ground like a predator ready to pounce. Dean had nicknamed it Little Bastard, and had the moniker painted on the rear by pinstriper Dean Jeffries, along with his racing number, 130. The car was more than just a vehicle to him. It represented freedom, speed, and the relentless pursuit of experience that defined his short but meteoric life. "She's all set, Jimmy," said Rolf Wutherich, Dean's German mechanic, wiping his hands on a rag as he emerged from beneath the hood. Rolf's accent was still thick, though he'd been in California for some time now. A skilled technician who understood the complex machinery of the Porsche better than almost anyone, he had been preparing the car all morning for the upcoming race in Salinas. Dean nodded, running his hand along the curve of the fender. "Thanks, Rolf. She feels different from the Speedster. Lighter." "She is lighter. And faster," Rolf replied with professional pride, "but she requires a different touch. You must be gentle with her at first, like with a new lover." He smiled, revealing a row of slightly crooked teeth. Dean laughed, a sound that came easily to him despite the brooding image he projected on screen. He reached into his pocket for a cigarette, lit it with practiced ease, and took a long drag. The smoke curled around his face as he exhaled, momentarily obscuring his features, those same features that had caused such a sensation in East of Eden, and were about to do the same in Rebel Without a Cause. He was dressed casually that day. Lee jeans, a white t-shirt, and his favorite red windbreaker. His hair was tousled, as if he had just rolled out of bed, though the effect was entirely deliberate. Everything about James Dean seemed simultaneously careless and carefully constructed, a contradiction that fascinated everyone who met him. "We should get moving if we want to make good time," Rolf suggested, glancing at his watch. "It's already past 3. Dean took another drag from his cigarette before flicking it to the ground and crushing it beneath his boot. "Yeah, let's roll." A small crowd had gathered nearby, mechanics, a few fans who had somehow learned of his departure, and several friends who had come to see him off. Among them was Bill Hickman, a fellow actor and driving enthusiast who had become close to Dean over the past year. "Hey, Jimmy," Bill called out, approaching with an easy swagger. "You sure you don't want a caravan up there? I could follow you in my car." Dean shook his head. "Nah, I need to get a feel for her on the open road. You head up with the others. I'll see you in Salinas." Bill nodded, then clapped him on the shoulder. "Take it easy out there, Jimmy. That's a lot of car for these roads." A ghost of a smile crossed Dean's face as he slid on his Ray-Ban sunglasses. "Don't worry," he said, his voice carrying that distinctive, soft drawl that seemed to contain both vulnerability and defiance. "That guy who hits us has to see us first." The words hung in the air like smoke, causing an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. No one commented on it. No one dared to. But later, those who were present would recall that moment with a sense of foreboding that reason told them they had no way of feeling at the time. Dean climbed into the driver's seat of the Porsche, settling himself into the low-slung bucket seat. The interior was spare, functional, designed for racing rather than comfort. Rolf took the passenger seat beside him, carrying a small bag with tools and personal items. The engine came to life with a turn of the key, the flat four-boxer engine producing a distinctive sound, not the deep rumble of an American V8, but a more urgent, higher-pitched mechanical symphony. The small crowd stepped back as Dean eased the Porsche out of the lot and onto Vine Street. A few hands raised in farewell, a few cameras flashed. Dean lifted his hand briefly in acknowledgement before focusing on the road ahead. The streets of Los Angeles opened before them as they headed north. The city was transforming in 1955, expanding outward in all directions as returning veterans and young families sought their piece of the American dream in the Sunshine State. New highways cut through old neighborhoods, gas stations and drive-ins sprouted at intersections, and billboards advertised cigarettes, movies, and household appliances with colorful promises of a better life. Dean navigated through the traffic with confidence, getting a feel for the car's response. The Porsche was nimble, quick to accelerate, and remarkably balanced. It felt alive beneath his hands, responding to the slightest input from the wheel or pedals. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" Dean said, a rare note of genuine enthusiasm in his voice. Cars were perhaps his greatest passion, even more than acting. On the set, he could be difficult, moody, unpredictable. Behind the wheel, he was focused, present, and alive in a way that few ever witnessed. "Yeah, she is," Rolf agreed. "But remember, Jimmy, this is not like your other cars. The engine is behind you. The weight distribution is different. You must adjust your driving." Dean nodded, his eyes fixed on the road. "I can feel it," he said. It's like the car is an extension of my body." They stopped for gas at a mobile station on the outskirts of the city. As Dean filled the tank, a group of teenagers recognized him and approached with shy excitement. He signed a few autographs, posed for a quick photo, and answered their questions with his characteristic blend of politeness and detachment. "Are you making a new movie, mister?" "Dean," one girl asked, her ponytail bobbing as she spoke. "Just finished one," he replied. "Giant. Should be out next year." "Is it true you're going to race in Salinas?" a freckle-faced boy inquired, eyes wide with admiration. Dean nodded, capping the gas tank. "That's the plan. My dad says racing is dangerous," the boy continued, a note of concern in his voice. Something flickered across Dean's face, something unreadable. "Life is dangerous, kid," he said quietly. "The trick is to live it anyway." Back on the road, they merged onto Highway 99, heading north toward Bakersfield. The landscape began to change, the urban sprawl giving way to the more open terrain of the San Fernando Valley. Fields stretched alongside the highway, interspersed with small towns and roadside establishments. The late afternoon sun bathed everything in a golden light that seemed to soften the edges of the world. Dean rolled down his window, letting the wind rush in. It tousled his hair and filled the car with the scent of dry grass and distant mountains. Rolf glanced over at him, noting the way the young actor seemed to physically relax the further they got from Hollywood. "You love this, yeah? The freedom of the road?" Rolf asked. Dean didn't immediately answer. When he did, his voice was thoughtful. "In Indiana, where I grew up, the roads go on forever. Straight lines cutting through cornfields. You can see the horizon, miles away. Out here, the roads twist and turn. You never know what's coming around the next bend. And that is what you prefer? The unknown?" Dean shrugged, a slight lift of one shoulder. "I don't know if I prefer it, but it's what keeps me awake." They stopped briefly in Bakersfield for coffee at a roadside diner. The place was typical of its kind. Vinyl booths, a long counter with swivel stools, and the pervasive smell of coffee and grilled onions. A waitress with tired eyes did a double-take when she recognized Dean but maintained her professional demeanor. As they sat in a corner booth, Dean stared out the window at the Porsche parked in the lot. "I keep thinking about the race," he said, his fingers drumming restlessly on the table. "About how it'll feel to really open her up." Rolf nodded. "You will do well. You have natural talent." "It's not about doing well," Dean replied, his gaze still fixed on the silver car. "It's about feeling alive." The coffee arrived, steaming hot in thick white mugs. Dean added sugar but no cream, stirring absently as he continued to look out the window. "Jimmy," Rolf said hesitantly, "I've been meaning to ask you something." Dean turned to him, eyebrows raised in question. "Why acting? Why racing? Why do you push so hard in everything you do?" For a moment it seemed Dean might deflect the question with one of his typical cryptic remarks. Instead, he took a sip of coffee and said simply, "Because time is short." They finished their coffee in silence, paid the bill, and returned to the road. The sun was lower now, casting longer shadows across the highway. They turned onto Highway 466 near Famoso, the road that would take them northwest toward Paso Robles and eventually to Salinas. The traffic was light, and Dean pushed the Porsche a bit harder, testing its limits on the straightaways. The engine responded eagerly, its pitch rising as they accelerated. The speedometer climbed, 60, 70, 80 miles per hour. The landscape blurred at the edges of their vision, the present moment sharpening into crystal clarity. In that moment, speeding along Highway 466 with the fading light of day all around them, James Dean appeared truly at peace. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, his posture relaxed yet alert. The perpetual furrow in his brow had smoothed out, and there was a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Rolfe looked over at him, struck by the transformation. "You look happy, Jimmy." Dean nodded, his eyes never leaving the road stretching endlessly before them. "I am," he said simply. "Right now, I am." The California landscape continued to unfold around them as they drove into the gathering dusk. The silver Porsche, a swift, gleaming arrow pointing toward Salinas, and toward a destiny that waited just around the bend. The morning of September 30th had begun like many others for James Dean in Hollywood. He had awakened early in his apartment on Sutton Place, the walls adorned with books, records, and the bongo drums he often played to clear his mind. The previous night, he'd been on the phone with Ursula Andress, the Swiss actress he'd been seeing casually, making plans they both knew might never materialize given his unpredictable schedule. As the morning light filtered through his blinds, Dean had moved with purpose, packing a small bag for the weekend trip to Salinas. His mind was already on the race, visualizing the track, the turns, the competition. Racing wasn't just a hobby for him. It was perhaps the only pursuit that silenced the restlessness that drove him in every other aspect of his life. By mid-morning, Dean had arrived at Competition Motors, where his silver Porsche waited. The garage was buzzing with activity, mechanics working on various vehicles, the air heavy with the scent of motor oil and gasoline. Dean had greeted Johnny von Neumann, the owner, with a nod before turning his attention to his car. "She's all ready for you, Jimmy," Johnny had said, patting the hood of the Porsche. "Rolfe's been tuning her all week." Dean had circled the car slowly, running his fingers along its sleek silver body. "She's beautiful," he'd murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. The morning had progressed with final preparations, paperwork, and conversations about the route. Several of Dean's friends had dropped by, including Bill Hickman and photographer Sanford Roth, who was planning to document the weekend's race for Collier's magazine. "I still think you should break her in more before racing her," Bill had advised, leaning against a workbench, arms crossed over his chest. Bill was an experienced driver himself, having worked as a stunt driver on several films. Dean had shrugged, lighting a cigarette. "No time. The race is tomorrow. At least take it easy on the drive up," Bill had pressed. "Those roads can be tricky, and you're not familiar with the car yet." The conversation had continued this way throughout the morning, with friends and colleagues offering advice that Dean acknowledged but seemed unlikely to follow. There was something about him that day, a combination of excitement and tension that was palpable to everyone around him. By early afternoon, a small crowd had gathered at Competition Motors. Word had spread that James Dean was taking his new Porsche to Salinas, and fans and friends alike had come to see him off. Among them was Earl Caskey, a fellow actor who had worked with Dean on a television production the previous year. "Jimmy, my man," Earl had called out, approaching with his characteristic enthusiasm. "Heard you're heading north for the races." Dean had nodded, shaking Earl's hand. "That's the plan. You should come up, watch me leave these California boys in the dust." "Wish I could," Earl had replied. "Got an audition tomorrow I can't miss. But listen, I saw the rushes from Rebel. You're going to blow everyone away, kid." A hint of a smile had crossed Dean's face. Despite his affected nonchalance, praise for his acting always seemed to reach something genuine in him. "Thanks, Earl. That means something, coming from you." As the afternoon wore on, Dean had grown increasingly restless. He'd paced around the garage, checked and rechecked the car, and glanced repeatedly at his watch. Finally, around 3 o'clock, he'd announced it was time to leave. "I want to get through the grapevine before dark," he'd explained to Rolfe, who would be accompanying him. The gathered crowd had moved outside to the parking lot, where the Porsche sat gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Dean had slipped on his red windbreaker, the same one he'd worn in Rebel Without a Cause, and prepared to get behind the wheel. Bill Hickman had approached him one last time, concern evident in his features. "Hey, Jimmy," he'd said, his voice lowered so only Dean could hear. "I know you love speed, but remember what happened to that kid in your first movie, the one who died in the Chicky Run?" Dean had tensed slightly, In Rebel Without a Cause, a character named Buzz drives off a cliff during a dangerous car game. The parallel wasn't lost on him. "It's just a movie, Bill," Dean had replied, his voice carrying a hint of irritation. "This is real life." "That's my point," Bill had insisted. "In real life, there are no second takes." For a moment, Dean had appeared genuinely thoughtful. Then, shaking off whatever reflection might have been taking hold, he'd smirked and quipped, "Take it easy out there, Jimmy." Mocking Bill's concern with an imitation of his voice, Dean had replied to himself, "Don't worry. That guy who hits us has to see us first." The words had hung in the air, creating an uncomfortable silence among those close enough to hear. Bill's face had paled slightly, and he'd taken a step back, as if physically distancing himself from the statement. "Jesus, Jimmy," he'd muttered. "Don't talk like that." Dean had just laughed, but the sound had held little humor. It was the laugh of someone pushing away a thought too uncomfortable to acknowledge. Phil Stern, a photographer who had documented much of Dean's rise to fame, had captured the moment with his camera. Later, that photograph would become one of the last images of James Dean alive, his face half hidden behind sunglasses, the ghost of that uncomfortable laugh still visible on his lips, the red windbreaker bright against the muted colors of the parking lot. As Dean had slid into the driver's seat and Rolf had taken his place beside him, a young fan had broken through the small crowd, rushing toward the car. "Mr. Dean! Mr. Dean!" the teenager had called out. "Can I have your autograph, please?" Dean had hesitated, then nodded. The boy had thrust a movie magazine toward him, open to an article about East of Eden. Dean had scrawled his signature across the page. "Are you going to win tomorrow?" the boy had asked, eyes wide with admiration. "That's the plan," Dean had replied, returning the magazine. "Be careful," the boy had added. "My dad says those foreign cars are dangerous." Something had flickered across Dean's face then, a moment of genuine emotion breaking through his carefully maintained facade. "Life's dangerous, kid," he'd said softly, "but it's pretty boring without a little risk." With that, he'd started the engine. The Porsche had come to life with a sound unlike the American cars most were accustomed to, higher-pitched, more urgent. Dean had revved the engine once, twice, the noise echoing off the surrounding buildings. Bill Hickman had stepped forward one last time, placing his hand on the door. "See you in Salinas, Jimmy. Drive like you've got a future." Dean had nodded, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. "Always do," he'd replied. But as he'd pulled away from competition motors, those earlier words continued to echo in the minds of those left behind. "That guy who hits us has to see us first." Words that, in just a few hours' time, would take on the weight of terrible prophecy. The Porsche hummed along Highway 466, cutting through the California countryside with precision. James Dean had settled into a rhythm with the car, feeling its responses, learning its personality. The road stretched before them, a ribbon of asphalt winding through rolling hills and farmland. They had made good time since leaving Bakersfield, the little car proving its worth on the open highway. "She handles beautifully," Dean said, breaking a comfortable silence that had lasted several miles. His hands rested lightly on the wheel, confident but not casual. Despite his reputation for recklessness, Dean was methodical behind the wheel, especially in a car he was still getting to know. Rolf nodded in agreement. "Yeah, she is balanced perfectly. The weight distribution is ideal." He glanced at his watch. "We are making good time. We should reach Paso Robles before sunset." Dean adjusted his sunglasses against the late afternoon glare. The sun hung low on the horizon now, casting long shadows across the landscape and bathing everything in golden light. It was the kind of light cinematographers dream about. The magic hour, when everything looks at once more real and more beautiful than it has any right to be. They passed a family in a station wagon, the children in the back seat pressing their faces against the window at the sight of the unusual sports car. Dean waved, a genuine smile crossing his face. For all his carefully cultivated image of brooding intensity, there was something in him that remained boyish, especially when it came to cars and the open road. "Look at those kids," he said, glancing in the rearview mirror. "Bet they've never seen anything like Little Bastard before." Rolf chuckled. "Probably not. American cars, they are." He searched for the word substantial. "This?" He patted the dashboard affectionately. This is a precision instrument. They drove in silence for a while, the landscape gradually changing as they continued northwest. The flatlands gave way to more varied terrain, with oak-studded hills rising on either side of the highway. Traffic was relatively light for a Friday afternoon, just the occasional truck or family car making the journey between the Central Valley and the coast. Dean rolled down his window, letting the wind rush through the cabin. His hair whipped around his face and he seemed to relish the sensation, the physicality of it, the reminder that he was moving through space at speed, alive in this moment. "You know what I love about driving," he said suddenly. His voice raised slightly to be heard over the wind and engine noise. "You have to be present. You can't be anywhere else but here." Rolf glanced at him curiously. "Is that not true of acting also? Being present?" Dean considered this, his eyes never leaving the road. "Different kind of present. When I'm acting, I'm searching for something, trying to find the truth in a moment that isn't real." He adjusted his grip on the wheel as they entered a curve. "When I'm driving, especially at speed, the moment is the truth. There's nothing to search for." It was perhaps the most philosophical Rolf had ever heard Dean be about his driving passion, and it struck him that there was more depth to this young man than many gave him credit for. Behind the rebel image was a mind that thought deeply about experience, about authenticity, even if he struggled to articulate it in conventional terms. They stopped briefly at a gas station near Blackwell's Corner, the last outpost before a particularly desolate stretch of highway. While Rolf filled the tank, Dean went inside to buy cigarettes. The attendant, a middle-aged man with oil-stained hands, did a double-take when he realized who his customer was. "Say, aren't you?" he began. "Just need a pack of smokes," Dean interrupted, placing money on the counter. He wasn't being rude exactly, but there was a wariness about him when recognized by strangers, a pulling back, a retreat behind the safety of his sunglasses and turned-up collar. The attendant nodded, took the money, and slid a pack of cigarettes across the counter. "Heading up to the races?" he asked, trying again for conversation. Dean nodded. "Salinas." "Well, drive careful," the man offered. "This next stretch gets tricky around sunset. Light plays tricks on you." Dean pocketed the cigarettes and headed back to the car, where Rolf was just replacing the gas cap. As they pulled back onto the highway, Dean lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply before blowing the smoke out through the open window. His mood seemed to shift, becoming more contemplative as the miles passed. The casual cockiness that had been so evident when they left Hollywood had given way to something quieter, more introspective. "You're quiet," Rolf observed after several miles of silence. Dean shrugged one shoulder. "Just thinking. About the race. About everything." Dean tapped ash from his cigarette out the window. "Did you know I almost died when I was 9 years old?" Rolf looked at him, surprised both by the revelation and the abruptness with which it came. "No, I did not know this." Dean nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Fell off a barn roof at my uncle's farm. Broke my front teeth, knocked myself unconscious." He took another drag from his cigarette. "First thing I remember when I woke up was my uncle's face looking down at me saying, 'Jimmy, you gotta be more careful, boy.'" He laughed softly, but there was little humor in it. Never was much good at careful. The sun was sinking lower now, the shadows lengthening across the highway. The quality of light was changing minute by minute, the golden glow giving way to the cooler, bluer tones of approaching dusk. Traffic had thinned further, the Porsche often the only vehicle visible on the long stretches of open road. As they approached Cholame, the landscape took on an almost ethereal quality in the fading light, rolling hills silhouetted against the darkening sky, occasional oak trees standing like sentinels along the roadside. It was beautiful in a stark, somewhat melancholy way. Dean pressed the accelerator a bit more, the engine responding eagerly as they climbed a gentle rise. The speedometer crept up, 70, 75, 80 miles per hour. The Porsche handled the speed effortlessly, seeming almost to come alive the faster they went. "Jimmy," Rolf said, a note of caution in his voice, "perhaps we should slow a bit. The light is tricky." Dean didn't respond immediately, his focus entirely on the road ahead and the sensation of speed. After a moment, he eased off the accelerator slightly. "You're right," he conceded. "Don't want to push our luck." They rounded a curve, and ahead of them spread the Cholame Valley, bathed in the last rays of the setting sun. It was a vista that demanded attention, the kind of natural beauty that California offered in such abundance. Dean's expression softened as he took it in. "Beautiful country," he murmured. Rolfe nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it is." He checked his watch again. "We are making good time. Another hour, maybe less, and we will reach Paso Robles." Dean nodded, but his mind seemed elsewhere, caught between the present moment and thoughts he wasn't sharing. He drove in silence for several more miles, occasionally lifting a hand to wave at children in passing cars, or acknowledging a truck driver with a nod. The highway narrowed as they approached Cholame, the landscape closing in around them. Traffic picked up slightly, mostly local vehicles making their way home for the evening. Dean navigated among them with ease, the Porsche responsive to his every command. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world into the half-light of dusk, Dean glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, he seemed to be studying himself as if trying to reconcile the image he presented to the world with whatever truth he carried inside. "Rolfe," he said suddenly, his voice quiet but clear, "we're almost there. The race has already begun." Rolfe looked at him curiously. "What do you mean? The race is tomorrow." Dean didn't elaborate, his attention returning to the road ahead where the headlights of an oncoming Ford Tudor were just becoming visible in the gathering dusk. The highway stretched before them, disappearing into the twilight, the final miles of a journey that had only just begun. Chapter 4. The Haunting Legacy. The news spread across America like wildfire. On the evening of September 30th, 1955, at approximately 5:45 p.m., a Ford Tudor sedan driven by 23-year-old Donald Turnipseed made a left turn onto Highway 466 near Cholame, California. The driver never saw the low-slung silver Porsche approaching until it was too late. The two vehicles collided with devastating force. James Dean was pronounced dead on arrival at Paso Robles War Memorial Hospital. He was 24 years old. Rolfe Wutherich, thrown from the vehicle, survived with serious injuries. Turnipseed walked away with minor cuts and bruises, forever marked by his unwitting role in the death of an American icon. Within hours, the telephone lines between California and New York were buzzing with the news. Jack Warner, head of Warner Brothers Studio, was among the first industry figures to be notified. Dean had just completed filming Giant for Warner's studio, the third and final film of his brief career. Warner's first thought was reportedly practical, whether Dean had completed all necessary sound dubbing for the film. But for millions of Americans, particularly the young, the news was devastating on a deeply personal level. Dean had embodied something essential about the post-war generation. Their restlessness, their questioning of authority, their search for authentic experience in an increasingly conformist society. With East of Eden, already released to acclaim, and Rebel Without a Cause, set to premiere just a month after his death, Dean was poised to become the voice of his generation. Now that voice was silenced forever. In the days following the crash, detailed accounts began to emerge. The last hours of Dean's life were reconstructed through witness statements and police reports. The stop at Blackwell's Corner, the setting sun casting long shadows across Highway 466, the fateful intersection where Turnipseed's Ford crossed the path of the Porsche. And then the stories began, the eerie coincidences, the premonitions, the strange details that seemed in retrospect to foreshadow the tragedy. Bill Hickman couldn't shake the memory of Dean's words before departure, "That guy who hits us has to see us first." The quote appeared in newspapers across the country, taking on the weight of prophecy. Had Dean somehow sensed what was coming? Had he been tempting fate with his cavalier attitude, or had fate already marked him, leaving him merely to play out his assigned role? Alec Guinness, the distinguished British actor, told of meeting Dean in Hollywood just days before the crash. Dean had proudly shown him the new Porsche, and Guinness had experienced an inexplicable sense of dread. "If you get in that car," he reportedly told Dean, "you will be found dead in it by this time next week." Dean had laughed off the warning. The car itself, the little bastard, became the focus of dark fascination. After the crash, it was sold for parts, and stories soon emerged of the components bringing misfortune to their new owners. A driver whose car contained the Porsche's engine was killed in a race. Another was seriously injured in a car containing Dean's transmission. The shell of the car, being transported on a truck, slipped off and crushed a mechanic underneath. When the wreckage was later put on display as a road safety exhibit, the garage housing it burned down, leaving only the car undamaged. These stories, growing more elaborate with each telling, transformed the Porsche from a machine into something more, a vessel of fate, a harbinger of doom, a physical manifestation of the price of living too fast, too recklessly. In the weeks following Dean's death, attendance at Rebel Without a Cause screenings broke records. Young people lined up around the block, many seeing the film multiple times, studying every gesture, every expression of the actor who had become, in death, the ultimate symbol of youth cut short. His performance as Jim Stark, troubled, sensitive, desperate for connection, took on new layers of meaning in light of his fate. Letters poured in to Warner Brothers, to Dean's family in Fairmount, Indiana, to magazines and newspapers. Fans expressed not just grief, but a profound sense of personal loss. "I never met him," wrote one teenage girl from Ohio, "but I feel like I knew him better than anyone in my real life. He understood what it feels like to be young and confused in this world." The funeral in Fairmount drew thousands, far more than the small town could comfortably accommodate. Dean was buried in Park Cemetery, near his mother who had died when he was 9 years old. His grave would become a pilgrimage site for generations of fans, many not yet born when he died. In Hollywood, the industry moved on with characteristic efficiency. Giant was completed with minimal disruption, other actors filling in for minor sound dubbing. When it was released in 1956, audiences watched with the knowledge that they were seeing a ghost. Dean's final performance preserved on celluloid, his last creative act frozen in time. For those who had known him personally, the grief was complicated by the contradictions of Dean himself. He had been difficult, temperamental, sometimes deliberately provocative. He could be intensely present in one moment and impossibly distant in the next. Friends and colleagues spoke of his talent with awe, but of his personality with bewilderment. He had lived at arm's length from the world, accessible to everyone through his screen persona but truly known by almost no one. Nicholas Ray, who directed Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, perhaps came closest to articulating the paradox. "Jimmy wanted to be loved," he said in an interview a year after the crash, "but he couldn't bear to be known." As the years passed, Dean's legacy only grew. Unlike colleagues who lived long enough to make bad films, take disappointing roles, age out of their youthful appeal, or reveal the all-too-human flaws that come with extended public exposure, Dean remained forever as he had been in those 3 films. Young, beautiful, intense, mysterious. He became the template for a particular kind of American masculinity, sensitive but tough, vulnerable but defiant. Subsequent generations of actors would study his performances, borrowing his mannerisms, his approach to emotional truth, his refusal to conform to traditional Hollywood hero archetypes. And always, threading through the mythology, were those final words reportedly spoken to Rolf just minutes before the crash. "We're almost there. The race has already begun." Words that seemed, in retrospect, to contain multitudes of meaning. Was he speaking literally about the journey to Salinas? Or had he somehow glimpsed a deeper truth, that his race against time was ending, that his brief, meteoric life was reaching its conclusion? Fans would debate this for decades, finding in those words whatever meaning they needed to make sense of the senseless, to find pattern in random tragedy, to transform an ordinary traffic accident on a rural California highway into something more meaningful, more fitting for the end of an icon. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Dean's final drive was not what was unusual about it, but what was ordinary. A young man in a fast car, heading toward a future he could see, but would never reach. His last day contained the same elements as countless others: friendship, ambition, irritation, reflection, casual interactions with strangers who would later struggle to recall exactly what was said. It was a day that could have been followed by thousands more like it. A drive that could have ended in Salinas rather than Cholame. A life that could have matured, evolved, disappointed, redeemed itself. Instead, it became the final chapter of a story that, like all great American myths, was too perfect in its tragedy to have been designed by anything but chance. James Dean lived fast, died young, and left a legacy that continues to haunt American culture, not as a ghost, but as a question: what might have been? And perhaps more profoundly, what was it about this young man that continues to resonate across the decades, speaking to each new generation as if directly to them? The silver Porsche is long gone. Highway 466 has been renamed. The witnesses have aged and passed on. But the image remains. A young man in a red jacket sliding behind the wheel of a silver sports car, hair whipping in the California wind, racing toward a horizon he would never reach.